When we're creating a unit in English, the first place you should begin is with the text. Never let yourself get too far from that text because that's the whole point of English. This isn't a class on history or science. This is a class on literature, and keeping that as the primary connection when you're working with a literary text makes it that much richer for students. So let's demonstrate that right now. We're going to do a critical reading or a close reading of one of the poems from Carver, A Life in Poems by Marilyn Nelson. So what does it mean to do a critical or analytical reading? It just means to go beneath the surface, right? To get that deeper meaning, which all good poetry should have. Poetry is such a compact art form. It should have layers and layers of meaning in every word and every phrase in order to make that condensed language really pack a punch. So we're going to start with, and here we have that definition of poetry from your book. We're going to start with Drifter. Drifter is a one-sentence poem that is connected with this photograph, which I found at the George Washington Carver National Monument in the National Park Services. It's one of the very famous early pictures of Carver when he is beginning to pursue his education. So let's begin just by reading it, listening to the sound of the language. Drifter. Something says find out. Why rain falls, what makes corn proud, and squash so humble. The questions call like train whistles, so at 14, 15, 18, 19, still on half fare over the receding landscape of the perceiving self, stares back from the darkening window. What does that amazing one-sentence poem capture? Well, here is one of the ways you could break it down with students. First of all, let's think about line breaks. When a poem is a single sentence, there's only one end stop, right? The conclusion of the poem. So the lines are forming breaks in thought that go beyond normal punctuation. And these breaks in thought are not rhymed. So what do these mean? Well, notice that the first line break emphasizes the phrase, that initial phrase, makes corn proud, and then squash so humble. And this contrast between proud and humble is emphasized by line break. That is where there is meaning in the poet's decision to make that break. And then lists and repetition, those are very important in this poem. So first, there's a list of questions about the natural world, followed by a list of years or ages, as George Washington Carver moves across the United States searching for answers. The sort of parallelism here between this series of questions and these series of ages where he's making these moves, crossing the country via train as a teenager, shows a physical sort of pursuit through time of answers to natural science questions that Carver was encountering. It also creates a sort of rhythm or cadence for these unrhymed verses, giving a sense of stylistic unity. And finally, there's a symbolism, right? In this litany of questions and ages resonates with railroad imagery. That is, the stops along a railway, the quick sort of glimpses you get out of the window as you're zipping through the countryside at speeds no one had ever imagined before. And through this imagery, Nelson is implying a connection between the physical journey on a train and Carver's internal drive for knowledge, that this desire is almost a steam engine propelling him with a force that exceeds typical human strength into a new world of understanding. All of that we can get through the way that this is constructed, the language that's chosen, and the very simplicity of the poem that forces us to pay attention to every single word. That is how you analyze a poem. So now Though let's go and kind of take a step back. What is the feeling that this poem gives? What sort of emotions does it evoke for the reader? That's a good sort of softball question to begin with when you're working with a class, and then you can move on to these more concrete ways to analyze a poem, because all of these are part of the impact of poetry. And then, because we're looking at this poem as part of a single collection about Carver, this poem is starting ideas and themes that are going to trickle throughout different poems, such as the term perceiving self. Perceiving self is a theme or idea that runs through many of these, beginning in Drifter, followed by the next poem, which is The Perceiving Self, a poem that describes Carver stumbling onto the scene of a KKK lynching. And the phrase continues to appear throughout the collection explicitly with Carver's experience of human evil in America during Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And so it first appears in a sort of ambiguous way in Drifter. But in the next poem, it's going to take on a very concrete meaning as Carver is perceiving evil in the natural world. Truly unspeakable evil as he sees a lynching. And how that perception is something that continues throughout his life. Even as he's seeing beauty and goodness, he's also aware of the terrible side of human existence, particularly in racism and Jim Crow and everything that was going on in the American South at that time. So that theme is coming up. The idea of Drifters also preparing for the way that the different poems are marking Carver actually moving through the countryside. So here we get a list of ages with Carver moving. In the poems that follow, we're actually going to get snapshots of things that happen when he's 15, 18, 19. And Drifter is setting that up for us. So sort of like setting up the plot or the narrative that explains the poems that are to come. All of these are things that happen when you're looking at a single poem within a collection that is interconnected so that one poem relates to the next poem in that collection. So all of these are ways that you can understand the text just by looking at the words, just by looking at what is within it. Next, we're going to look at how context, that is the things that are around the text, the history, the science, the social setting when Nelson is writing, are also part of the message.